An unlikely encounter. The private terminal at the city's most exclusive airport was abuzz as usual, its polished surfaces and plush seating catering to a certain kind of clientele. People in designer suits, glancing occasionally at their watches, exchanged quiet words or indulged in brief phone calls. To them, this was just another day in a world filled with the benefits of privilege. But to Martin Thompson, a senior security guard with more than a decade of experience, this was his domain, a place he guarded with strict oversight, an exclusivity he protected with a devotion he wore like a badge. Martin was a tall, robust man in his early 40s, with a carefully trimmed goatee and a demeanor that commanded respect, though some might say it bordered on arrogance. His tenure at the terminal had instilled a rigid sense of responsibility within him. He wasn't simply enforcing security. He was maintaining the very essence of who deserved to be here and who didn't. Martin's eyes scanned the crowd, as they did every day, ready to spot anything out of place. On this day, his gaze landed on a striking figure who seemed, in Martin's mind, like she didn't belong here. She was poised and elegant, wearing a tailored blazer and carrying herself with undeniable confidence. Her deep brown skin was flawless, her hair styled in soft waves that framed her face. Her heels clicked against the polished floors, each step as deliberate and assured as her piercing gaze. Martin found himself almost offended by the casual confidence she exuded as she moved through his terminal. Without hesitating, Martin took a few brisk steps forward, positioning himself in her path. "Excuse me, miss," he said, his voice polite but firm as he blocked her way. "This is a restricted area. Are you lost?" He maintained a professional smile, though he could feel a flicker of frustration at her composed reaction. The woman stopped, her eyes steady as they met his, her brows knitted slightly, the only hint of her irritation. "No," she replied, her tone unwavering. "I'm here to board the jet in Hangar 3. I have a meeting in Los Angeles." Martin's polite smile tightened. "I think you must be mistaken," he said, trying to keep his voice neutral. "The jet in Hangar 3 is reserved for high-ranking executives and owners." He let his words linger, as if emphasizing what he believed to be her mistake. "Yes, I know," she said, her gaze unwavering. "That's why I'm here." For a brief moment, Martin was caught off guard by her poise. Most people he'd stopped in the past had either sheepishly acknowledged their mistake or gotten flustered, often trying to explain themselves. But this woman was different. She wasn't about to explain herself to him, and that unnerved him. "Miss," he pressed, a bit more insistent now, "I don't know who you think you are, but this area is not open to the public. I'll need to see some form of identification. Otherwise, I'll have to ask you to leave." She raised an eyebrow, a hint of exasperation in her expression. "I don't see you asking anyone else for their ID," she observed, glancing around at the other well-dressed men and women moving freely through the terminal. There was a momentary shift in her posture, a tension that Martin caught but didn't understand. His polite demeanor faltered, replaced by a slight edge. "Those are regulars here," he explained curtly, "people who are recognizable and who belong in this area." He saw no harm in reminding her of the exclusivity of the space, hoping she would take the hint and leave. Instead, she looked at him with a mixture of mild disbelief and restrained irritation. "Ah, I see," she said quietly, almost as if talking to herself. "You're assuming I don't belong here." Her voice was calm, but Martin felt the words pierce through his own calm exterior. Still, he maintained his stance. "Look, lady," he began, his voice lowering slightly as he noticed a few of his colleagues glancing their way. He wasn't about to let this scene escalate into an embarrassment for himself or for the terminal. "I'm sure you're just in the wrong place. Maybe you got confused by all the luxury around here. It's understandable. But I need you to step away from this area. Let's not make this difficult for either of us." The woman's face remained expressionless, but her voice held a sharp edge. "Are you finished?" she asked, her eyes steady and unyielding. For the first time, Martin felt a prick of discomfort, as though he'd missed something crucial. Before he could respond, a young man in a sharp suit appeared at her side, glancing between them with a slightly nervous look. "Miss Blake," the man said, inclining his head respectfully, "I'm terribly sorry for the delay. I didn't realize you'd already arrived." Martin's mind stumbled over the words, "Miss Blake." His heart skipped as the realization dawned on him. This was Amara Blake, the new owner of the company that had recently acquired a majority share in the airport. Martin's confidence crumbled. He turned back to face her, but her expression remained unreadable, though her eyes held a quiet power he hadn't noticed before. She wasn't flustered or angry. She was calm and composed, as if the entire scene had been beneath her. Miss Blake," he stammered, his voice betraying his shock. "I didn't realize. I thought." He swallowed, the weight of his mistake settling heavily in his chest. Miss Blake raised a hand, silencing him effortlessly. "You thought I didn't belong here, isn't that right?" she asked softly, but with a firmness that held him rooted to the spot. The murmurs of the onlookers faded into silence. Martin felt his colleagues' eyes on him, but none dared speak up. He felt exposed, humiliated, and ashamed all at once. His usual confidence had evaporated, leaving him defenseless in the face of her quiet reproach. He struggled to find the words, anything that could ease the tension, but he knew there was nothing he could say that would undo what he had just done. "Miss Blake, I'm deeply sorry," he finally managed, his voice barely a whisper. "I didn't mean any offense." Her gaze softened, though her tone remained even. "The problem, Martin, isn't that you offended me. It's that you judged me without knowing a single thing about me. You decided I didn't belong here, based on your assumptions." Each word struck him like a blow. He'd spent years upholding a standard he believed in, but now he realized just how flawed that standard was. He'd failed to see the people behind the appearances he scrutinized each day. Martin's gaze dropped, unable to bear the weight of her disappointment. "I made a mistake," he whispered, his voice thick with regret. For a moment, Miss Blake simply looked at him, the silence stretching uncomfortably between them. Then she spoke, her tone measured and calm. "You're correct, Martin. You made a mistake. And unfortunately, apologies don't erase the impact of our actions. But I'm not here to punish you. I'm here to offer you an opportunity to learn." Martin's heart raced. She wasn't going to fire him. He could barely believe it. "There's a sensitivity and inclusivity training starting next month," she continued, her gaze steady on his. "You'll be enrolled in it. If I don't see a change in attitude after that, then we'll be having a very different conversation next time." The words hung in the air, carrying the unmistakable weight of a final warning. Martin managed a small nod, the shame nearly overwhelming. "Thank you, Miss Blake," he murmured. It was all he could say, but it felt woefully inadequate. She acknowledged his thanks with a brief nod, then turned to leave, her heels clicking softly on the floor as she walked away with the same confidence he'd once found presumptuous. Now he could only feel respect. As he watched her disappear down the corridor, Martin felt his own mistakes settle over him like a weight he couldn't shake. The image of her calm, unwavering stare stayed with him, replaying in his mind as he returned to his post. He knew, deep down, that he had crossed a line, and for the first time, he felt a raw determination to make things right, no matter how difficult the path forward might be. The weight of reflection. The hours after Amara Blake's jet took off felt longer than any shift Martin had worked in years. The terminal, typically a space he commanded with silent authority, now felt foreign. His own pride in his position, the strict sense of duty he had built up over the years, lay in pieces around him, scattered like the remnants of a glass wall shattered by a single powerful truth. As he leaned against a window overlooking the runway, Martin's thoughts circled back to Amara Blake's calm, unwavering gaze. He could still feel the sting of her words, as though they cut deeper than any reprimand from his superiors ever had. She hadn't shouted, hadn't even raised her voice, but her message was clear, reverberating through his mind with painful clarity. The shift came to an end, but instead of feeling the usual sense of satisfaction and relief, Martin only felt emptiness and unease. His colleagues' glances seemed to linger a moment too long, silent judgments echoing through their expressions. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were waiting for something, waiting to see what he would do next, or if he would be able to make amends. He wondered if he had already crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Back in his small, sparsely decorated apartment, Martin tried to unwind, hoping the familiar rhythm of his routine would ease his mind. He poured himself a glass of water, stared out of his window at the city's skyline, and replayed the encounter once again. The woman's elegance, her confidence, the way she had held her ground. It was all a mirror held up to his own faults. In the past, he would have brushed it off, moved on without a second thought. But this time was different. This time, he knew he couldn't just move on. The next morning, Martin was exhausted before he even walked into the terminal. His supervisor, Carl, a man Martin had once thought of as his closest friend at work, was waiting for him. Carl was a slim, wiry figure, his silver hair neatly combed back, his demeanor almost always light-hearted and approachable. But today, his face held none of the usual warmth. Instead, Carl looked at him with an expression that mingled disappointment with something else, perhaps pity. "I heard about what happened yesterday," Carl began, his voice quieter than usual. Martin nodded, bracing himself for the conversation he knew was coming. "I messed up," he admitted, his voice sounding hollow even to himself. "I misjudged her." Carl's gaze softened slightly, but the tension remained. "Martin, this isn't just about a single misjudgment. It's about why you made that judgment in the first place." Martin felt his throat tighten. He had always respected Carl's perspective, but he hadn't expected his supervisor to cut straight to the heart of the matter. "I thought I was doing my job," he muttered, struggling to find a defense, however weak, for his actions. Carl shook his head. "Your job is to provide security, yes, but not at the expense of respect and fairness. Do you think you treated Miss Blake with either?" The words hung heavily in the air. Martin looked away, unable to meet Carl's gaze. I don't know," he finally whispered. "I thought I was protecting the space, keeping it secure." Carl sighed, folding his arms. "Security isn't about gatekeeping based on your assumptions, Martin. It's about ensuring everyone feels safe and respected, regardless of who they are or how they look. Miss Blake didn't have to give you another chance, you know. Most people in her position wouldn't have." Martin nodded slowly, feeling the shame settle deeper. "I know," he admitted. "She told me I'd have to go through sensitivity training, and honestly, I'm nervous." "Good," Carl replied, his tone softening slightly. "If you're nervous, it means you're starting to see things differently. Take this as an opportunity to grow. She's giving you a second chance. Don't waste it." For the first time, Martin felt a flicker of hope, though it was tinged with a sharp edge of fear. Could he really change? Could he unlearn years of rigid thinking and start seeing people beyond his own narrow perspective? He didn't know, but he was willing to try. The days passed slowly, each one filled with a new tension as Martin grappled with his thoughts. Finally, the day of the sensitivity training arrived. Martin arrived early, hoping that a prompt start would show his dedication. As he entered the small, brightly lit conference room, he felt his nerves spike. He was greeted by the facilitator, a woman named Karen, who offered him a warm but assessing smile. "Welcome, Martin," she said, gesturing to a chair near the front. "I'm glad you're here." Her words, though simple, carried a sincerity that felt both comforting and challenging. Martin sat down, glancing around as more employees filed in. People from various departments, all of whom he recognized in passing, but had rarely interacted with on a personal level. As the room filled, he noticed a few familiar faces: Brianna from customer service, Jerome from maintenance. He wondered if they knew why he was here. The thought made his stomach tighten. Once everyone was seated, Karen began with an introduction on the concept of unconscious bias, explaining how subtle judgments and assumptions could affect every interaction and decision. She shared statistics about how biases affected people's opportunities, relationships, and even their sense of self-worth. At first, Martin found himself pushing back mentally. He felt as though she was speaking to a crowd he didn't belong to, a group that was different from him. But then, Karen shared a story about an executive who'd been turned away from an event at her own company. The woman hadn't looked the part, so security had assumed she was out of place, just as Martin had assumed with Miss Blake. The story resonated painfully, each word cutting through his defenses and leaving him exposed. This was his story too. He had been that security guard, denying someone's place based solely on an assumption he had no right to make. The session grew more personal as Karen instructed the group to pair up and share experiences where they had felt judged or treated unfairly. Martin's partner was Jerome, the maintenance worker he'd often seen cleaning the floors or fixing minor issues around the terminal. He had always treated Jerome with a distant politeness, never stopping to get to know him or to consider the challenges he might face. Jerome was a quiet, thoughtful man in his late 20s, with a sharp intellect hidden beneath a shy demeanor. He opened up to Martin hesitantly at first, sharing stories of times he'd been questioned or watched suspiciously in stores, the way people seemed to form assumptions about him from the moment they saw him. "People just look at me and think they know who I am," Jerome said, his voice steady but laced with a resigned frustration. "It doesn't matter what I'm wearing or what I'm doing. They just see me and decide they know what kind of person I am." Martin swallowed, feeling an ache of guilt and discomfort as Jerome's words struck a nerve. It was almost exactly what Miss Blake had said to him during their encounter. He had dismissed her, disregarded her presence and her right to be there, because he'd assumed he knew who she was without asking a single question. When it was Martin's turn to share, he hesitated, his usual confidence evaporating. He looked down, gathering his thoughts before speaking quietly. "I always thought I was just doing my job," he began. "I thought I was being responsible, making sure only the right people came through. But I guess I've been letting my own assumptions cloud my judgment. I've hurt people without even realizing it." Jerome nodded, his expression softening with a surprising understanding. "We all make mistakes," he said quietly. "But now that you know, it's up to you to change." Karen brought the session to a close, asking each participant to commit to a small change in how they approached their work. For Martin, the answer was clear. He needed to unlearn the judgments he had internalized over the years. He needed to see people as individuals, not just faces in a crowd. As he left the session, a sense of clarity began to form in his mind, a determination to live up to the opportunity Miss Blake had given him. The days following the training felt strange, almost surreal, as Martin attempted to implement his newfound resolve. He greeted people differently, not with the same rigid formality, but with a sincere attempt to connect, even if it was just through a quick nod or a brief smile. He noticed Brianna glancing at him curiously, her expression softening when he made an effort to acknowledge her presence rather than brushing past her. It was a small change, but one that felt monumental to Martin, who had spent years avoiding real connections with anyone he deemed outside his professional responsibilities. One afternoon, as Martin was finishing up his shift, he noticed an elderly man struggling with his bags near the entrance. Without a second thought, he approached him, offering a warm smile and taking the man's bags in his own hands. "Here, let me help you with those," he said, feeling a sense of purpose in the small act of kindness. The man looked up, surprised but grateful, and nodded his thanks. "Thank you, young man," he said with a small, relieved smile. "It's nice to see a friendly face around here." Martin felt an unexpected warmth spread through him as he helped the man to his gate. For the first time, he understood that his role wasn't just about enforcing security. It was about creating a welcoming environment, about showing respect and compassion to everyone who entered the space he was meant to protect. That night, as he replayed the day's events, Martin felt a quiet sense of pride. It was only a small step, but it was a step in the right direction. He thought of Miss Blake, of the grace she had shown him despite his mistakes, and resolved to continue down this path, no matter how challenging it might be. He would prove that he could be someone worthy of her trust, someone who could rise above his own limitations. In the weeks that followed, Martin began to feel a gradual shift, not only in how he saw others, but in how others saw him. His colleagues greeted him with warmth, and even Brianna, who had always kept her distance, began to engage him in small, friendly conversations. His once solitary post had become a place of connection, a reminder of the change he was striving to create. The memory of Miss Blake's calm gaze stayed with him, a constant reminder of the journey he had begun. A journey not just of redemption, but of growth. And for the first time in years, Martin felt hopeful, his heart lighter and his mind clearer as he stepped into each new day with a renewed purpose, a new perspective. Weeks passed, and Martin settled into his transformed role, though he was well aware that it was only the beginning of a much longer journey. He moved through the terminal with a newfound awareness, engaging more openly with colleagues and travelers alike. Each day, he focused on dismantling the quiet barriers he'd built around himself over the years. Yet, in the back of his mind, he knew he hadn't fully faced the reality of his mistake with Miss Blake, and he suspected that the upcoming review with her would be a defining moment. It was on a quiet Tuesday morning that Martin received an email marked urgent from Miss Blake's assistant, Logan. The message was short but direct, requesting Martin's presence in the executive lounge for a follow-up meeting on the diversity and inclusivity program. His heart raced as he reread the message, feeling a twinge of anxiety. Had his efforts been enough? Had he demonstrated the growth that Miss Blake was hoping to see? Taking a deep breath, he straightened his uniform, smoothing out the slight creases as he mentally prepared himself for the conversation. The executive lounge was an opulent space that he rarely entered, with its plush seating and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered sweeping views of the runway. The sleek, modern design spoke of wealth and sophistication, and Martin suddenly felt a pang of discomfort, as though he didn't quite belong there. When he arrived, Logan was waiting outside, his usual polite but reserved expression in place. Logan nodded as he approached, his sharp suit and calm demeanor giving him an air of quiet authority. "Miss Blake is ready for you," Logan said, gesturing toward the glass doors. "She wanted to go over the progress with the program." Martin nodded, his throat tight with nerves. He walked into the lounge, and there she was, Amara Blake, standing near the windows, her back to him, gazing out at the runway. Her posture was as poised and assured as he remembered, but there was a sense of quiet contemplation in her stance, as though she was deep in thought. "Miss Blake," Martin greeted, doing his best to keep his voice steady. She turned, her expression unreadable but calm, and gestured for him to sit across from her at a low table. As he settled into the leather chair, he felt his pulse quicken, aware that this conversation could shape not only his immediate future, but possibly his entire career. "Martin," she began, her tone measured, "thank you for meeting with me today. I've heard good things about your progress with the program, and I wanted to take this opportunity to discuss some of the observations I've received." Martin nodded, unable to find the right words to respond. He sensed that she wasn't here to offer simple praise. She was here to hold him accountable, to ensure that his transformation was real and lasting. She leaned forward slightly, folding her hands together on the table, her gaze direct. "You've shown improvement," she said, her voice even. "Colleagues have noticed a difference in how you approach people, in how you interact with the team. That's commendable." The relief that washed over him was almost tangible, but he kept his expression neutral, knowing that she wasn't finished. "However," she continued, her tone softening, "improving your behavior is only part of the journey. To truly create lasting change, you'll need to develop a deeper understanding of why this happened in the first place. It's about learning to see people beyond your assumptions." Martin felt a pang of shame at her words. He'd hoped that his efforts had shown her he was serious about change, But he realized now that she was challenging him to dig deeper, to confront the roots of his own biases. "I understand, Miss Blake," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know I have a long way to go. I'm trying to be better, but sometimes I feel like I don't even know where to start." She regarded him for a moment, her gaze softened by something that looked almost like sympathy. "Growth isn't a straight path, Martin. It's a process of continuous learning and unlearning. And it's not something that happens overnight. But you've taken the first step, which is more than most are willing to do." Her words resonated with him in a way that was both humbling and inspiring. For so long, he had relied on his routines, his rigid sense of order, as a way to define himself. Now, he was being asked to redefine himself entirely, to embrace vulnerability and empathy as strengths rather than weaknesses. "Thank you for the opportunity, Miss Blake," he managed, his voice steadier now. "I won't waste it." She nodded, a slight smile curving her lips. "I believe you, Martin, and I have a proposal for you, one that I think will give you an opportunity to put these new perspectives into practice." His curiosity piqued. He leaned forward, eager to hear more. "What is it?" Miss Blake pulled a slim folder from her bag and slid it across the table toward him. Inside were details of a new initiative titled the Customer Inclusion and Respect Program, aimed at fostering a culture of respect and empathy throughout the entire airport, from security to customer service to administration. "We want to implement this program across all of our terminals," she explained, "and I'd like you to take on a leadership role in overseeing its launch. You'll work with employees across different departments to ensure that everyone understands the importance of empathy, inclusivity, and respect. It will involve training sessions, team discussions, and a review of our current practices." Martin's eyes widened as he flipped through the pages, his heart racing with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. This was far beyond his usual duties as a security guard. It was an opportunity to shape the very culture of the terminal, to create the environment that Miss Blake had envisioned. "I don't know what to say," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm honored and nervous." She laughed softly, a sound that was both comforting and grounding. "Good," she replied. "You should be. This role will challenge you in ways you might not expect, but I believe you're capable of rising to the occasion." Her words felt like a lifeline, a reminder that he was more than the sum of his past mistakes. He looked up, meeting her gaze with newfound determination. "I'll do my best, Miss Blake, I promise." The following weeks were a whirlwind of preparation and planning. Martin found himself in meetings with people he had previously only passed in the hallways. Managers from customer service, supervisors from maintenance, even executives who normally operated far above his usual rank. Each meeting challenged him to think critically, to listen actively, and to consider perspectives he had once ignored. One morning, he led his first training session with a group of customer service agents, sharing his story with a vulnerability he had never shown before. As he recounted his mistakes and the lessons he'd learned, he saw a mixture of surprise, empathy, and understanding in the faces of his audience. It was a humbling experience, one that left him feeling both exposed and validated. After the session, Brianna, the customer service agent he'd begun to connect with, approached him. She looked at him with an expression that was both respectful and curious, as though seeing him in a new light. "That was brave, Martin," she said softly, her gaze unwavering. "I think it's important for people to see that even someone in a position like yours can make mistakes and grow from them." Martin smiled, feeling a warmth he hadn't expected. "Thank you, Brianna. Honestly, I never thought I'd be standing here, sharing all of this. But I realized that if I wanted others to change, I had to start with myself." She nodded, a thoughtful expression crossing her face. "It's a good start, Martin. And I think it's inspiring for the rest of us, too." As she walked away, Martin felt a surge of pride, tempered by a sense of responsibility. He wasn't just working to prove himself to Miss Blake. He was working to create a culture where people like Brianna felt seen, valued, and respected. It was a purpose that went far beyond his original job description, but it was one he felt called to fulfill. A few days later, Martin found himself leading a team meeting with employees from various departments. The group sat in a circle, their faces a mix of curiosity and skepticism. Martin knew that some of them likely viewed the initiative as little more than corporate lip service, a checkbox to appease the higher-ups. But he also knew that for real change to happen, he would have to earn their trust. "Look," he began, his tone candid, "I know some of you are wondering why this program is even necessary. You might be thinking it's just a bunch of talk, that it won't change anything." A few employees exchanged glances, and he could sense the unspoken agreement. He took a deep breath, deciding to be as open as possible. "I used to think the same thing," he admitted. "I thought I was doing my job just fine, that I didn't need to change. But I was wrong. I was letting my own assumptions get in the way, and it nearly cost me everything." He could feel the tension in the room ease as people began to listen, truly listen, to his words. Martin continued, sharing his experience with Miss Blake, the shame he'd felt, and the commitment he'd made to become a better person. "This isn't just about following new policies or checking boxes," he said, his voice steady. "It's about creating an environment where everyone feels respected, where we all see each other as individuals. That's something I failed to do, and I'm here to make sure none of us makes the same mistake." As he spoke, he could see a shift in the room. People leaned forward, nodding, their expressions softening as they absorbed his words. By the end of the meeting, Martin felt a quiet sense of accomplishment, knowing that he had taken the first step in building the foundation of a new culture. That night, as Martin walked through the empty terminal, he felt a profound sense of gratitude. The journey he had embarked upon was far from over, and he knew that there would be days when he stumbled, days when he questioned whether he was truly capable of change. But for the first time in his life, he felt a sense of purpose that went beyond himself. As he looked out at the dimly lit runway, the memory of Miss Blake's calm but powerful words echoed in his mind. He understood now that this wasn't just about redeeming himself. It was about creating something lasting, something that would outlive his own time at the terminal. It was about helping others see the world through a kinder, more open lens, a lens he had only just begun to appreciate. And as he turned to leave, he felt a renewed sense of determination, knowing that he was finally on a path that was both humbling and transformative. The man who had once judged people from a place of fear and prejudice was now working to build a legacy of respect and empathy, one small act at a time, a test of resolve. The following weeks were a transformative period for Martin, but they were also far more challenging than he'd anticipated. He was no longer merely enforcing the rules. He was actively working to reshape them, to create a foundation of respect and empathy. But in a world as fast-paced and high-pressure as the private terminal, change did not come easily. One Friday afternoon, as Martin was wrapping up his shift, he noticed a man approaching the check-in counter with an air of entitlement that was impossible to miss. Dressed in a tailored navy suit with silver cufflinks, the man had the look of a seasoned executive. His phone was in one hand, his briefcase in the other, and his expression was one of impatience. Martin recognized him as a frequent traveler, a man known to demand quick service and extra attention. This time, however, he seemed especially on edge. As the man reached the counter, Brianna, the customer service agent, greeted him with a warm smile. "Good afternoon, sir. How can I assist you?" Without so much as a glance in her direction, he held up his boarding pass, his voice tinged with irritation. "My flight is delayed," he snapped, "and I've been waiting in the lounge for nearly an hour. I expect you to find a solution." Brianna kept her composure, her voice professional. "I apologize for the delay, sir. I can assure you that we're doing everything we can to expedite the process." The man scoffed, clearly unimpressed. "That's not good enough," he muttered, casting a disdainful glance at her. "Maybe someone with a bit more authority could assist me. I'm here every month, and I expect a certain level of service." Martin felt his pulse quicken. He could see Brianna's shoulders tense, though she maintained her professionalism. This was exactly the type of behavior he had been working to address, a subtle yet damaging display of disrespect, an assumption that Brianna was somehow less competent simply because she was there to serve him. Taking a deep breath, Martin approached, stepping up to the counter and placing himself in the man's line of sight. "Is there a problem here, sir?" he asked, keeping his tone calm but firm. The man turned to him, a flicker of irritation flashing across his face. "Are you the manager?" Martin kept his gaze steady. "I'm part of the team that ensures this terminal operates smoothly. Brianna is handling your situation, and I can assure you that you're in very capable hands." The man seemed to consider challenging him further, but ultimately thought better of it. With a dismissive nod, he stepped back, his impatience still evident, though he had relented. Brianna shot Martin a grateful look as she continued processing the man's paperwork. When the man finally left, Brianna let out a sigh of relief. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice filled with gratitude. "People like him, they think we're just here to cater to them, that we're invisible." Martin nodded, feeling a surge of empathy for her. He understood now, in a way he never had before, what it felt like to be dismissed, to be seen as less than human because of the assumptions of others. After the incident, Martin made it a point to support his colleagues openly, especially when dealing with difficult passengers. He knew that leading by example was the only way to make a real impact, and he hoped that his actions would encourage others to do the same. But as he continued his efforts, he began to face subtle resistance from some of his colleagues, people who felt that his approach was unnecessary, even excessive. One morning, as he was briefing a few of his team members on the new inclusion practices, he noticed Carl, his supervisor, standing at the back of the room, his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. Martin continued with the briefing, but he could feel Carl's gaze on him, a silent pressure that made him question his own words. After the meeting, Carl approached him, his voice low but direct. "Martin, I've been watching you, and I can see you're making a real effort here. But some people, well, they're not convinced. They think you're taking things a bit too far." Martin frowned, his confidence faltering. "What do you mean?" Carl sighed, glancing around to ensure no one else was listening. "Some of the guys in security feel that all this focus on inclusivity is softening our approach. They're worried it's going to affect our ability to do our jobs effectively." The words hit Martin like a blow. He had poured his energy into this initiative, believing that it would bring positive change, but he hadn't anticipated that some of his own team members would see it as a weakness. "Carl," he began, choosing his words carefully, "I understand their concerns, but I don't believe that treating people with respect and empathy compromises our security. If anything, it strengthens it." Carl gave him a hard look. "That's easy for you to say, Martin. But you've got people who've worked here as long as you have, people who think you've changed too much, that you're not the same Martin they knew. They're not sure they can rely on you anymore." The accusation stung, and Martin felt a swell of defensiveness. He had worked side by side with these men, shared long shifts, and countless hours on the floor. And now they were questioning his loyalty because he was trying to be a better person. "I haven't changed who I am," he said, his voice edged with frustration. "I've just learned to see people for who they are, not who I assume them to be." Carl sighed, his expression softening slightly. "Look, Martin, I'm not saying you're wrong. But change is hard, and not everyone's going to be on board with it right away. Just be prepared. You're challenging a lot of old habits, and that's going to make some people uncomfortable." Martin nodded, though he felt a knot of tension settle in his chest. He hadn't realized just how deeply rooted some of these attitudes were, even among people he considered friends. But he knew that if he wanted to create real change, he couldn't back down now. As the weeks went by, Martin's resolve was tested in ways he hadn't anticipated. He encountered moments when he felt the old instincts creeping back, moments when he found himself judging someone based on appearance or assumptions. But each time, he caught himself, reminding himself of the lessons he had learned. He could feel himself growing, but it was a slow, painful process, one that required constant vigilance and self-awareness. One afternoon, he received a call from Logan, Miss Blake's assistant, requesting an impromptu meeting. His pulse quickened at the unexpected request. He wondered if Miss Blake had noticed the resistance he was facing, or if perhaps she had concerns about his progress. When he entered Miss Blake's office, she greeted him with a warm smile, her expression calm and open. "Martin, thank you for coming on such short notice," she said, gesturing for him to sit. He settled into the chair across from her, feeling a mixture of nervousness and anticipation. "Is everything all right, Miss Blake?" She nodded, though her gaze was contemplative. "I've been hearing about the progress you've made, as well as some of the challenges you faced. Change is never easy, Martin, especially when it requires people to confront their own biases. But you're handling it well." Martin felt a surge of relief at her words, though he could sense there was more to the conversation. However, she continued, "I'd like to address the incident with the businessman at the counter. I was informed that you intervened to support Brianna, and while I appreciate your dedication, I also want to ensure that this program remains balanced. We're here to foster respect, but we must also maintain professionalism." Martin nodded, feeling a pang of self-doubt. Had he overstepped? Had his eagerness to protect his colleagues led him to act too aggressively? "Don't misunderstand me, Martin," she added, her tone reassuring. "Your actions were commendable, but as a leader, it's important to know when to step back and allow others to handle situations on their own. Trusting your team to navigate difficult interactions is part of empowering them." The words resonated deeply, reminding him of the importance of balance. He had been so focused on proving himself, on making amends for his past mistakes, that he hadn't considered the value of letting others grow as well. "I understand, Miss Blake," he said, his voice steady. "I'll keep that in mind." She smiled, a warm expression that eased his lingering tension. "Good. I have faith in your ability to navigate this. Remember, leadership is about guiding, not controlling. You're doing well, Martin. Don't lose sight of that." As he left her office, Martin felt a renewed sense of clarity. He understood now that growth wasn't just about changing himself. It was about fostering an environment where everyone could flourish. It was about creating a culture of mutual respect, where people felt valued and empowered to be their best selves. The next day, Martin put Miss Blake's advice into practice. He encouraged Brianna and the other customer service agents to share their experiences and strategies for dealing with difficult passengers, giving them the space to express their frustrations and offer solutions. He listened more than he spoke, offering support and guidance only when necessary. It was a different approach, one that required him to relinquish some control, but he could see the positive impact it had on his team. Gradually, he noticed that the atmosphere in the terminal was beginning to change. Colleagues who had once been wary of him now approached him with questions, seeking his input on handling situations with greater empathy. Even Carl, who had initially voiced doubts about his approach, began to acknowledge the positive shift in morale. One evening, as Martin was finishing up his shift, he noticed a young woman in her early 20s standing near the entrance, looking lost and unsure. She wore a simple outfit, her hair tied back in a ponytail, and held a small duffel bag at her side. Martin could see the apprehension in her eyes, the way she glanced around as though searching for reassurance. Without hesitation, he approached her, offering a gentle smile. "Excuse me, miss," he said, his voice warm. "Are you looking for someone, or do you need any help?" She looked up, her expression one of relief. "Oh, thank you," she replied, her voice soft. "I'm here for a connecting flight, but I've never been in a terminal like this before. I didn't know where to go." Martin felt a pang of empathy, remembering his own first experiences in intimidating, unfamiliar places. "It's a big space," he said kindly. "I'd be happy to show you where you need to go. Let me walk you to your gate." As they made their way through the terminal, Martin found himself engaging her in light conversation, asking about her travels and offering reassurance. When they finally reached her gate, she looked at him with genuine gratitude. "Thank you so much," she said, her eyes bright with relief. "I've never had someone take the time to help me like that. I really appreciate it." Martin felt a swell of pride, knowing that he had made a difference, however small, in her experience. "You're very welcome," he replied, giving her a reassuring nod. "Safe travels." As he walked back to his post, Martin felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that he was living up to the vision Miss Blake had set for the terminal. He was no longer just a security guard. He was a leader, a mentor, and a supporter. And in that moment, he understood that he had found a purpose far greater than he had ever imagined. It wasn't about his title or his authority. It was about creating a space where everyone felt valued, respected, and seen. And as he moved through the terminal, he felt a quiet certainty settle within him, a resolve that would guide him through whatever challenges lay ahead. For the first time, he knew he was exactly where he was meant to be, and he was ready to face the future with confidence and integrity. Rising to a new challenge, the sun was just beginning to set as Martin lingered in the quiet terminal, watching the amber hues cast shadows across the polished floors. It had been a long day, filled with meetings, new hires to orient, and passengers to assist. Yet he felt an invigorating sense of purpose that kept him there long after his shift had ended. The customer inclusion and respect program was gaining traction, and the atmosphere in the terminal had noticeably shifted. Martin could feel it in the way people smiled a little more, nodded a bit deeper in passing, and paused just a moment longer in their interactions. But his responsibilities were growing too. Miss Blake had recently informed him that the program would be expanding to the company's other terminals, and she wanted Martin to play an instrumental role in overseeing the new implementations. He was excited but also apprehensive. This would require him to leave his comfort zone, to interact with unfamiliar teams across various airports, and to prove that his transformation was more than just a temporary effort. It was a few days after receiving this news that Martin was called into a meeting with Miss Blake and several board members. They wanted a progress report, a breakdown of the successes and challenges he'd faced in implementing the program, and most crucially, a strategy for replicating it across other locations. The thought of presenting his ideas to a group of executives filled him with a sense of both pride and dread. He knew that this was an opportunity not only to showcase his hard work, but to set a new standard for the company. If he could convince them of the program's value, he could make an impact on a scale he'd never imagined. On the morning of the presentation, Martin arrived early, his nerves a jumbled mess. He had prepared meticulously, staying late in the terminal each night to review data, write reports, and anticipate any questions the board might have. But as he sat in the sleek, intimidating conference room, surrounded by people in crisp suits and watchful eyes, he felt his confidence waver. Miss Blake was seated near the head of the table, her presence calm and reassuring. She caught his eye and offered him a small nod, a silent reminder that he belonged there. Drawing strength from her encouragement, Martin stood and began his presentation. "Good morning, everyone," he started, keeping his voice steady. "Thank you for giving me this opportunity to share the progress we've made with the Customer Inclusion and Respect program." He launched into a detailed account of the program's impact on employee morale, citing improvements in customer satisfaction ratings and a decrease in complaints. He described how the training sessions had led to more respectful and empathetic interactions with travelers, fostering an atmosphere that went beyond mere professionalism to create genuine connections. The board members listened intently, some nodding as he spoke, others jotting down notes. But as he reached the section on proposed expansions, one of the board members, a man named Mr. Langston, cleared his throat, interrupting him. "This is all very well and good, Martin," Mr. Langston said, his tone neutral but challenging. "But I think we need to address the elephant in the room. These kinds of programs are costly, both in terms of time and resources. What makes you think this will work on a larger scale?" Martin felt a bead of sweat form on his brow, but he held his ground, remembering everything he'd learned about confidence and conviction. "I understand the concerns, Mr. Langston," he replied, his voice even. "But the data shows that this program isn't just about employee morale. When employees feel respected and valued, they're more engaged, and that translates directly into customer satisfaction. We've seen a decline in complaints and an increase in positive feedback. In a service-oriented industry, that's invaluable." Mr. Langston looked unimpressed. "I'll be blunt, Martin. We've seen initiatives like this come and go. They make a lot of noise initially, but they rarely have lasting effects. Why should this be any different?" The question hit hard, but Martin took a moment to steady himself, his mind racing. He knew that his answer here would define his credibility and the future of the program. "This is different because it's not just a program. It's a cultural shift," he said, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. "I know it sounds ambitious, but I've seen the difference it's made firsthand. People are treating each other with more respect, and it's reflected in every interaction, from how our employees work together to how they engage with passengers. This isn't a temporary fix. It's about changing the way we view and value people across the board." A quiet settled over the room, and Martin could feel the weight of the board's scrutiny as they processed his words. He looked at each of them in turn, hoping they could see the sincerity behind his conviction. It wasn't just about proving himself. It was about the impact he believed in with every fiber of his being. Finally, Miss Blake leaned forward, breaking the silence. "I believe Martin is right," she said, her tone confident. "This initiative represents a shift in our core values. If we want to be an industry leader, we must show that we are willing to invest in our people. This isn't just a short-term project. It's a commitment to our company's future." Mr. Langston looked thoughtful, nodding slightly as he listened to Miss Blake's words. He glanced back at Martin. His expression softened, though still reserved. "All right, Martin," he said, a hint of concession in his tone. "I'm willing to support this expansion on a trial basis. We'll monitor the results at the additional locations over the next year. If it shows the kind of success you're promising, we'll consider a more permanent rollout." Relief flooded Martin's chest, and he managed a steady nod. "Thank you, Mr. Langston. I won't let you down." In the days that followed, Martin threw himself into preparing for the program's expansion. He began working with Miss Blake and Logan to design a training curriculum that could be easily adapted to different terminals, crafting guidelines and materials that emphasized empathy, inclusivity, and respect. He worked with HR to develop metrics for tracking the program's impact, knowing that measurable results would be crucial to winning over skeptics like Mr. Langston. But just as he felt he was gaining momentum, Martin encountered an unexpected challenge, one that tested his resolve in ways he hadn't anticipated. It was a busy afternoon, and Martin was conducting a final walkthrough of the terminal when he noticed a young man in a maintenance uniform, scowling as he struggled with a heavy equipment cart near the main entrance. The man's name was Louis, a new hire who had joined the maintenance team just a few weeks earlier. Louis had been quiet and reserved, keeping mostly to himself, but Martin had heard whispers among the other maintenance workers that he was having trouble adjusting to the job. As Martin approached, he noticed Louis muttering under his breath, his frustration evident. "Need any help?" Martin offered, keeping his tone light. Louis looked up, his face flushed with a mix of embarrassment and irritation. "No, I'm fine," he said curtly, though his grip on the equipment was shaky. These carts are a pain. They're too heavy, and nobody listens when I say we need newer equipment." Martin nodded, sensing an opportunity to connect with the young man. "I hear you. It's not easy starting out with equipment that doesn't work well. I can talk to maintenance about getting some replacements if you think it would help." Louis hesitated, the initial defensiveness in his expression softening slightly. That would be helpful. Thanks." As they began to move the cart together, Martin could see that Louis's frustration ran deeper than the faulty equipment. There was a tension in his posture, a guardedness that Martin recognized from his own early days. He decided to approach it gently. "I know starting a new job can be overwhelming," Martin said, his tone casual. "Especially in a place like this, where everything moves fast. If you ever need help, just let me or one of the team leads know. We're here to make sure you succeed." Lewis glanced at him, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. "Thanks. I didn't expect anyone here to care," he admitted quietly. "Most people just brush me off." The words struck a chord with Martin, a reminder of the isolation he had once felt in his own role. He made a mental note to check in on Lewis regularly, knowing that sometimes a small act of kindness could make all the difference. Over the following weeks, Martin watched as Lewis slowly began to come out of his shell. With each day, he grew more confident, more comfortable in his role, and Martin couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. It was a small victory, but it embodied the very essence of what the Customer Inclusion and Respect program was all about: fostering an environment where everyone felt valued. One day, Lewis approached Martin with a shy smile, holding a coffee in one hand. "Hey, I just wanted to say thanks," he said, his voice earnest. "I know it probably doesn't seem like a big deal, but it's been a while since I felt like I belonged somewhere." Martin accepted the coffee with a smile, his heart warmed by Lewis's words. "You're part of the team, Lewis. We're glad to have you here." As Lewis walked away, Martin felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had once viewed his job as a set of rigid responsibilities, tasks to be completed with little regard for the people around him. Now he saw it as a calling, a chance to make a genuine impact on people's lives. The program's expansion was eventually approved for a year-long trial across 3 additional terminals, and Martin spent the next several months traveling to oversee the implementation. Each location presented its own unique challenges, its own set of personalities and dynamics. But Martin approached each terminal with the same patience and empathy he had developed under Miss Blake's guidance, understanding that real change required time and persistence. As the months passed, the impact of the program became evident. Customer satisfaction ratings continued to improve, and complaints dropped significantly. Employees reported feeling more connected and supported, and a sense of camaraderie began to blossom in places that had once been marked by rigidity and isolation. And then, one afternoon, Miss Blake called him into her office, her expression one of quiet pride. "I wanted to congratulate you, Martin," she said, her voice warm. "The results speak for themselves. You've done an incredible job, and you've shown us all what's possible when we lead with empathy and respect." Martin felt a surge of gratitude, his heart full as he looked back at the journey that had brought him to this moment. He had started as a man defined by assumptions, by rigid boundaries and rules. But with Miss Blake's guidance, he had grown into someone capable of seeing beyond those boundaries, of fostering a culture that valued every person for who they were. "Thank you, Miss Blake," he replied, his voice steady. "I couldn't have done it without your support." She smiled, her gaze thoughtful. "I think you would have found your way eventually, Martin. Sometimes, all we need is someone to remind us of what we're capable of." As he left her office, Martin felt a quiet pride, a deep sense of fulfillment that came from knowing he had made a difference. He had found a purpose that extended beyond his own growth, a purpose that touched the lives of everyone around him. And as he walked through the terminal, greeting familiar faces and exchanging smiles with his team, he knew that this was only the beginning. The work was far from over, but he was ready for whatever challenges lay ahead, knowing that he had finally become the person he was meant to be: a leader, a mentor, and most importantly, a man worthy of respect. The legacy of change. Martin stood on the rooftop of the terminal's parking structure, watching planes taxiing across the runway as the evening sky deepened to indigo. The last year had transformed him in ways he hadn't thought possible. The once rigid, skeptical security guard had become a leader, a mentor, and the face of an initiative that was reshaping the entire company's culture. From his vantage point, he could see the terminal where he had worked for over a decade, but it felt like he was looking at a different place entirely, a place where kindness, respect, and connection thrived. The Customer Inclusion and Respect program had not only spread to 3 additional terminals, but had now been approved for a company-wide rollout, a decision made unanimously by the board after seeing the powerful results in employee morale and customer satisfaction. Reports of positive interactions poured in regularly, and Martin's inbox was filled with messages from team leads across the country, sharing stories of employees who felt more valued, passengers who noticed the change, and moments that reflected the spirit of inclusivity he had worked so hard to foster. Yet, despite the progress, Martin couldn't shake a sense of bittersweet anticipation. Today's meeting had revealed that Miss Blake was preparing to step back from her daily responsibilities at the airport. She had decided to pursue a new venture, one focused on bringing similar inclusivity programs to other industries, and she had asked Martin to join her team as her senior advisor. It was an incredible opportunity, one that would allow him to make an even broader impact, but it also meant leaving behind the terminal, the people, and the life he had come to cherish. As he stared out over the bustling runway, he felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He knew what he had to do, but the thought of leaving the place that had changed him so profoundly was more difficult than he'd expected. The next morning, Martin walked into the terminal with a sense of purpose, determined to make the most of his last days there. He greeted his colleagues warmly, taking the time to ask about their lives, their families, and their plans for the future. There was a sense of camaraderie, now that had once felt foreign to him, a connection that bound them together in their shared commitment to the values they had cultivated. Later that day, Carl approached him near the security checkpoint, his usual reserved expression replaced by a rare smile. "I heard the news," Carl said, giving Martin a firm handshake. "Miss Blake's got herself a good one." Martin chuckled, feeling a swell of gratitude. "Thanks, Carl. I wouldn't have gotten here without people like you pushing me in the right direction." Carl nodded, his gaze softening. "You've come a long way, Martin. When you started this whole initiative, I wasn't sure what to make of it, but seeing how you've changed, how you've made everyone around you better, well, it's something I respect more than I can put into words." Martin smiled, his throat tightening with emotion. "That means a lot, Carl. I've learned so much here, and I'm going to miss this place." Carl's expression grew serious. "You're leaving behind a legacy, Martin, and it's our job to keep it alive." The words settled deep within Martin, filling him with a renewed sense of responsibility. The program might have begun as his project, but now it belonged to everyone who believed in its message. It was a legacy that would carry on long after he left. As his final week at the terminal approached, Martin decided to host one last staff meeting, a chance to bring everyone together to celebrate the success they had built as a team. He reserved a small conference room, arranging for food and refreshments, and invited employees from all departments. He knew that this would be more than just a meeting. It would be his farewell. The room buzzed with laughter and chatter as employees from maintenance, customer service, security, and management gathered together, their faces bright with anticipation. Martin looked around, seeing people he had once barely acknowledged now gathered together as friends and colleagues, united by a shared purpose. When the room quieted, Martin took a deep breath, feeling a surge of emotion as he prepared to address them. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. "When we started this journey, I didn't know what to expect. All I knew was that I needed to change, and I wanted to create a place where everyone felt respected and valued." He paused, meeting the eyes of the people he had come to know and care for. "I couldn't have done this alone. Each of you played a role in making this terminal a place where kindness and respect are more than just words. You've created something real, something that matters, and I am so incredibly proud of every single one of you." Brianna, who was standing near the front, raised her hand, her voice filled with warmth. "You've changed the way we look at each other, Martin. You showed us that we can be better, that we can build each other up. We're going to miss you." A ripple of agreement moved through the room, and Martin felt tears prick his eyes. He had always thought of himself as someone who kept others at a distance, but now he realized just how deeply these people had become a part of his life. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm going to miss you all too. But I know you'll carry this forward. This program isn't about me. It's about each of you and the respect you bring to every interaction, every day." As the meeting concluded, employees approached him one by one, offering hugs, handshakes, and words of encouragement. He listened to each person, feeling the profound impact they had all made on his life. By the time the room emptied, he felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that he was leaving the program and the people who had made it thrive in capable hands. The night before his final day, Martin sat alone in the terminal's lounge, reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. He remembered his early days, the rigid rules he had enforced, the assumptions he had made about people. He had once thought he understood his job, but it wasn't until he had met Miss Blake that he truly learned what it meant to protect and serve others with dignity. Just as he was preparing to leave, he noticed Miss Blake entering the lounge, her expression calm and thoughtful. She approached him with a warm smile, taking the seat across from him. "I wanted to see you before your last day," she said, her voice gentle. "How are you feeling?" Martin smiled, a mixture of gratitude and sadness in his eyes. "It's bittersweet. I'm excited about the new role, but it's hard to leave this place behind." She nodded, her gaze filled with understanding. "You've built something remarkable here, Martin. This program wouldn't exist without you." He shook his head slightly, humbled by her words. "It wasn't just me, Miss Blake. It was everyone here, everyone who believed in it." She reached across the table, placing a hand on his. "True leadership isn't about doing everything yourself. It's about inspiring others to carry the torch. And you've done that beautifully." They sat in silence for a moment, both of them lost in thought. Finally, she spoke again, her voice soft. "I want you to remember something, Martin. You have a gift for bringing out the best in people, for helping them see the goodness in themselves. Don't ever lose that." Martin felt a swell of emotion, her words resonating deep within him. "Thank you, Miss Blake, for everything. I wouldn't be here without you." With a final, understanding smile, she rose from her seat, giving him a reassuring nod. "I'll see you soon, Martin. We have a lot of work ahead of us." As she walked away, Martin felt a renewed sense of purpose. He knew that his journey was far from over and that he was about to embark on a path that would allow him to make an even greater impact. The next morning, as he walked through the terminal one last time, Martin took in every detail, the familiar faces, the bustling atmosphere, the quiet moments of connection he had come to cherish. He was leaving behind a piece of his heart, but he knew that he had left it in capable hands. The program would continue to thrive, carried forward by the people who believed in its mission. Just before he reached the exit, he was stopped by Logan, Miss Blake's assistant. Logan handed him an envelope, a small smile on his face. "Miss Blake wanted you to have this." Curious, Martin opened the envelope and found a handwritten note inside. "Martin, thank you for believing in this vision and for becoming the leader I always knew you could be. Your journey has been a testament to the power of growth, humility, and compassion. I have no doubt that you will continue to inspire everyone you meet. With respect and gratitude, Amara Blake." As he read the note, Martin felt a surge of pride, a deep sense of fulfillment that came from knowing he had truly made a difference. He folded the note carefully, slipping it into his jacket pocket as he took one last look around the terminal. With a steady heart and a clear purpose, Martin stepped through the exit, leaving behind a legacy that would endure long after he was gone. The man who had once judged others from a place of fear and rigidity was now a leader, a mentor, and an advocate for change. He knew that the journey ahead would be challenging, but he was ready, strengthened by the knowledge that he had already changed his own life and the lives of countless others for the better. As he walked into his new future, Martin carried with him the lessons, the connections, and the profound understanding that had defined his transformation. This wasn't just the end of a chapter, it was the beginning of a new legacy, one built on respect, empathy, and the unshakable belief that everyone, regardless of who they are, deserved to be seen, valued, and respected. And with each step he took, Martin knew he was exactly where he was meant to be.